everyone. Super excited to connect you today with John Gasko, one of my heroes, and I have no idea what direction this is going to go because this gentleman has done so many things that I would have considered impossible that he's made inevitable. This is going to be a blast. And so John has been a pioneer across many domains. To me, most inspiringly across the education domain, became a tenured professor, which of course is a lifetime achievement, and then said, you know what, I'm going to risk it all because I need to go and at a college, tenured professor at a college, went back and then said, I'm going to risk it all to now go try and drive the future of education at high school level. And so he's now the Chief Wellbeing Officer at Uplift Education. And if you said, what's the future of education? Then my answer would be, ask John. So epic to see you, sir, and super excited to jump into the conversation today.
Thank you, Curt. So good to be in your company and really appreciate the opportunity and feel humbled by the invitation.
And to give you context, John and I met, on a sub-zero freezing night camping out in the canyons of Utah as we crossed and stepped off of a log into the freezing water en route to our campsite that night. So that's how we met. We met in wild adventures, and so this was the most exciting, yet tame adventure that we've been on together. And so, John, I'd love, the first part is always, what is something that was impossible in your life that you've made inevitable, and how did you accomplish that thing that most of us would have said we're not even going to try? How did you pull that miracle into being?
Thank you. I'm going to share a more of a personal journey in response to the question. That journey centers in a cauldron of pain, born into a family in New York. My father was a schizophrenic. My mother was a manic depressive. And if ever, as my grandfather would say, there were two more troubled adults that probably shouldn't have given birth to a child, namely me, it was them. And yet, I received the gift of life to and through these two different lineages of mental anguish, trauma, and pain. So I'll say from the outset, the impossible was, how am I even here on this podcast? And so growing up, I would say, as most babies are birthed in amniotic fluid and swim in currents and love, I emerged from a very difficult birthing process. It was as if I was already given the signals that the road ahead would be dangerous and arduous. And so my mother was in labor for 36 hours. And they finally had to cut her open to yank me out because I just didn't want to come. And I did. I'm grateful that I did. But I was born into a circumstance where the amniotic fluid disappeared, and I was basically lived surrounded in a fluid known as cortisol. And so my mother early on divorced my father because my father, at one point in his life, started hearing voices, and my mother had no capacity to deal with schizophrenia. This was circa 1977. I was born in 1973. And so I have vivid memories as a 4-year-old of seeing my mom and dad fight because my father would go out to bars in New York and turn over the drinks of people at the bar and start to try to evangelize them because my father had a delusion of grandeur that he was a living incarnation of St. Paul. And he took a lot of beatings. Many a nights came home shredded, blood everywhere. And my mother just couldn't fathom that. So I grew up, my earliest memories of my father are seeing him come home late at night, beaten and bruised pretty badly. My father was eventually removed and sent away to a series of psychiatric hospitals in upstate New York. And what remained was me and my mom, an equally troubled person who had her own traumatic past growing up in rural poverty in the Catskill Mountains, who herself learned to cope with her reality through an addiction to alcohol and prescription drugs. And so growing up in the midst of that kind of reality eclipsed all kinds of opportunities because the impossible for me truly was simply just wondering if I was going to make it. Was I going to survive this? And so I learned all kinds of adaptive and maladaptive behaviors to try to cope with the fact that I was an only child with a schizophrenic father imprisoned in a psychiatric hospital, being raised by my mother who was never home, and
Well,
trying
John,
to,
just for
yeah,
us to try and understand how you transcended that portal. So how did that world feel like on that side of it? I can only imagine. I love the Einstein quote that you and I have talked about of there's one fundamental decision to make, whether it's a friendly or hostile universe, and it would feel like at that moment there's only one decision based on your world, is it's a hostile universe.
absolutely. It was indeed hostile. I was bullied and beaten regularly. Um, but I want to make a pivot. Um, and that was one time I got beat so badly by a gang of kids that my mother said, you've got to learn to defend yourself. And so the person who inflicted the most pain on me actually gave me a lifeline in the midst of it, even though she probably didn't recognize it. And she brought me to the studio of Master Cho and dropped me off and said, "Can you teach my son how to fight?" And so at about age 7 or 8, I was still very much immersed in the hostile world. The way it felt was a constant sense of alone, a constant sense of a fear of abandonment, which is a journey I still am in the lineage and stream of trying to heal. Um, it felt just always unsafe. If you know brain science, like reticular activation system, mine was on steroids from an early age. And all I did was surveil, looking for threats, looking for when the next blow might come, either in the intimacy of my home or in school or on the walk home from school. And so she brought me to a Korean Taekwondo master, Master Cho, and she said, "Tell me what it costs. I'll work overtime if I have to do it." And I learned a language around age 8 that started to transform my understanding of who I was. And so it was rocky at first, and I was kind of like this feral child trying to adapt to the decorum of the dojo. But I started getting like introduced to a protective language, one that Master Cho would talk about as like the martial spirit, and that you are enough. It was not just about fighting, it was about rewiring me to try to build an armor that initially needed to be hard and impenetrable, but ultimately down the line would give way to something much softer. And so I learned how to punch, and I learned how to kick, and I learned how to defend, and I became really good at it, Curt, and would advance pretty rapidly in tournaments and started to kind of get my second wind. And all of a sudden, the kids at school, when they pick on me, I was the one who could return the beating. And the problem with it, though, is as a survival mechanism, I got this newfound confidence through Master Cho and became quite proficient at fighting. But I was using that like to cushion the turbulence on the inside, which I would describe as fear and anger, really, really, with really, really deep roots. And so something strange started to happen to me at an early age. And that was like I started to enjoy getting hit. So the harder you could hit me and punch me, the more I thrived, because it was one of the few things at that time that made me feel alive. I could take the hits. I could no longer, just be subject to other people's abuse and bullying and belittling, but I was starting to develop a personality that, you know, where there was this sense of empowerment and agency. And so that journey continued. My grandparents became angels for
Well, sir,
me.
if we just pause there for a second.
Yeah.
I'm just in awe of the miracle of your mom was doing everything that she could to compensate for the world that she was in. And the moment that she saw her son was in pain, the miracle of like, I'll do whatever it takes to help. And she had the wisdom to be aware that she could not help you with the thing that you needed, but that like she went and found the person that did. You know, I love that gift that she was had the humility. As a parent of five, I am constantly humbled. I want to teach the kids and tell them here's what they need, and many times they cannot hear it from me either because the intensity transfer is too close, or there's someone infinitely more qualified. So it really does take a village, and so it's I love your the miracle of how you found Master Cho and then how you adapted. You know, you then the teacher appeared and then you showed up.
Yeah. And just to revisit something you said about my mom, what was like the struggle that I had is the abuser at the same time gives me the way out. And I don't know that it was intentional, but there was clearly some recognition in her that of this like simultaneous inability to be the mom that she wanted, but at least give me a language and a way to endure the hits, both from her that continued. I just didn't hit her back. But when the kids at school did, I hit back, man. And so that continued, man, all the way up until ninth grade. That was like my story. I also discovered I was a pretty good athlete. And so I started taking hits in other ways as a college football player, and I'm sorry, as a high school football athlete. And, I was really good. I was a running back, so I could take hits and deliver them. And so I was finding ways to deal with this turbulence within that was about like violence to some degree, like giving and taking. But like not being able to like necessarily process that became a bit of a shield and a cover for the work that needed to happen internally. Um, and so in
This is
ninth grade,
fascinating. So
yeah,
tell me more. Like my hallucination would be that the ability to take hits became the ability of you could now measure how resilient you were. So like that became the store of value of like it wasn't the taking the hit was I'm that resilient. So in a Navy SEAL sense, I can survive Hell Week. I mean, I went through. Most people say it's amazing in the SEALs to go through 7 days of it, but you went through. It sounds like the first 13 years of it.
absolutely, yeah. And so something happened in ninth grade. Um, my mother just didn't come home one day, and she just didn't come home. And I didn't know what to do. I had really wonderful grandparents who I knew I could call, but I didn't. And so I just started to enjoy some quiet. And so it didn't worry me. I was worried, but not worried, and figured she's somewhere. She'll show up needing to sober up at some time. And she stopped coming home. She just didn't come home. And so I, as a young person at the time, you know, I would go to practice, football practice, but I stopped going to school. And an angel in the form of a guidance counselor kept trying to call me to figure out what was going on, and I wouldn't answer the phone. And so he called the next of the emergency contact, who was my grandmother, told her that, for some reason, we can't get a hold of John. He's not coming to school. And we need you to intervene, or else we're going to have to call Child Protective Services. And so within like, my grandmother lived about 2 hours away at the time. Um, I was living in Kingston, New York. She was in a small hamlet in the Catskill Mountains called Grahamsville, New York. And she immediately just left work, got my grandfather, and drove because I wasn't picking up the phone. And yeah, I still have this like memory of the banging on the door, and so I opened it and my grandmother's there. It still like brings up, some emotion.
I can only imagine the contrast. We're feeling like you weren't getting love and support, and then now you have, as I interrupted you earlier, and you're saying they became the angels in your life, where the moment that someone says you're in need, they're
Yeah, and so exactly, man, like showing up. And my mother was her daughter, and so she knew to some degree. I don't think it was ever truly revealed until I confessed it to her what the real nature of it was. because I learned a mechanism of silence just to mute it all and tune it all out. Anyway, so she said, "What is going on? Where's your mom?" We didn't know where she was, but we ultimately found out that she had checked herself into a psychiatric ward in a hospital nearby, and was trying to detox. But we didn't discover that till later. And so my grandmother said, "Well, you know, we're here for you, and we're going to help." And I told my football coach, I broke down and told him also what was going on. And initially, he was such a good man. His name was Coach Kwasnowski, Kingston football, Kingston Tigers, and he said, if you'd like, you can come stay with me and my family.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and so it was
You're
like
surrounded by angels.
they were coming, man. They were flying around, and embodying, not only in family members, but the helpers were showing up as, the guy who yelled at me all the time because I was missing routes, or, became the guy who was like, oh, and I can provide you with some protection as you go through this. And so I remember sitting in a Friendlies. I don't think that exists anymore as a chain. Um, but I used to love going there when I could. My grandparents, when they visited, would bring me there. So they brought me to Friendlies and gave me a Jim Dandy Sunday and said, "Would you like to stay with your football coach, or would you like to come stay with us?" And I chose the path to stay with them. And so they ended up adopting me, taking sort of control of my development from age roughly 13 and 14.
So you moved to the Catskills. You
I
moved.
did. I moved from kind of an urban setting, Kingston, New York, about an hour outside of New York City, to Grahamsville, New York, a hamlet in the Catskill Mountains. And which, if you know like Wendell Berry and you think about like the rural communities he writes about it, that's like what I got moved into. And so it was like even an ecological shift alone in going from urban, ugly, dirty, nasty, like constantly surveilling for threats to like, being living on a mountain, with green stuff everywhere. And my grandparents were both lifelong teachers. So what was great is they had a lot of time for me. And I want to name one moment, to kind of go back to this journey of like, while my outer armor was hardened and I was capable of protecting myself, I yet was not able to confront with courage the cauldron, like, that was really stirring beneath, that was rooted in fear and anger. um, and so my my first year, I finished the ninth grade year and I did okay. In my 10th grade year, all the demons and dragons started to emerge from
Of
beneath the
course,
waterline.
because now you were in a safe place, right? So you were now beginning to heal and beginning to integrate and process.
Yeah, man, and that was not easy, like being surrounded
I
by
can't even
love.
imagine.
Yeah, like being surrounded by love, going to a school where it was just like, it was like a school that still did like home ec, and I was like smelling like cupcakes and stuff. I was like, where am I, man? And
John, how long did it take you to even start to crack that hard outer shell? Right. It sounded like you had, you were a Spartan, right? You were going to feel nothing, and I'm certain. I can only imagine the uncertainty it felt to say I'm going to start to trust. Like, how did you even begin that process?
my grandmother asked me if I would be open to speaking to a man, and it turned out his name was Dr. Alan Schneiderman, and he was a psychologist, who apparently, my grandmother, as a teacher, whenever she'd deal with troubled boys, would always get in touch with Dr. Schneiderman, and in some cases pay for those families to have access to that herself. And so she asked me if I'd want to go hang out with Dr. Schneiderman after school, like once a week. And so I was like, okay, I'll give it a chance. And so Angel, in the form of a healer, became present in my life. I knew that I was on the right track with him because I walked in and the first thing I saw was this beautiful flower. I didn't even know what its name was. And every time I would see him, there'd be like a different beautiful flower. And what I found out was both Dr. Schneiderman and his wife were very much anchored in the Japanese aesthetic worldview of ikebana and, like a Zen aesthetic. And they had like martial arts books everywhere. And so it was as if all the breadcrumbs were there for me to tumble down this rabbit hole like Alice did, but the rabbit hole being into this inner world. Um, and so I worked with him every week for a year. And the moment of transformation that I think you're alluding to, Curt, was when he said, "How would you feel if I invited your mother to join us?" And at that point, I wasn't talking to her. I had a lot of anger. I refused to allow her into my life because of this abandonment
This is
that
your
I felt.
sophomore year, right? So it's about a year later ish.
Exactly. Yep. Sophomore year. By the way, I was failing every single subject in school at that time. I just couldn't engage. Um,
It's like
uh,
it's unfathomable for me to imagine you at this place, like as the most revolutionary educator that I've met. So
100%. Yeah. I was failing everything. I had no cognitive capacity to hold anything. I was emotionally like reactive and a somewhat of a train wreck. And Dr. Snyderman started to help me rebuild some of those skills to get some insight into why I was feeling the way that I did. Like the language of psychotherapy became a lifeline in this case. Um, and he said, "I think we need to bring your mom in." It's like, no way. You can't bring her in. That's like a violation of our trust. And he said, no, it's in fact, it's the next stage on your journey. And then until you confront this, you will be stuck. And so my mom started coming. She was in a recovery journey at the time herself through 12 steps and through different rehabilitation settings to get off drugs and alcohol. And I remember just at one point in that process, the floodgates opened, and it was like literally as if my whole body wept. The tears of like, 15 years, like in one setting. So that bathwater of cortisol that I was immersed in for years now became washed through like my own system of washing. And I guess, at some point I was able to forgive her. And then, like
was that at that time? I asked because I've had challenges in my life and people that I've held derogatory names and stories for upwards of 15 years before I said, oh, that was actually my angel. I wouldn't be in this conversation with you now had that not happened. But it's taken me upwards of 15 years in some cases to do that. So, and I've
it
had
was,
nothing on the order of your experience. So, like, was that in that sophomore year, or when did you get to that point of forgiveness?
I think there was an initial that when that floodgate happened, I knew that was part of it. Now, over time, there was still work to do, but I would say there was a pretty significant, kind of a falling off the horse experience, like St. Paul, to go back to that analogy, connecting it back to my dad, where, like a new set of lenses were made available to me, and that was a gift that I was able to sort of, see her, um, you know, in her own suffering, such that, I knew. And so I was able to do it that year.
I love the way you express that as a knowing. That's for me as a kinesthetic. There's just things that I know that feel different, and I had no idea of this portion of your story. All I know is when I met you, I could feel a resolute strength in you that is only comes from someone that's traversed extraordinary difficulty and has overcome it. And so, I mean, I am in awe and overwhelmed by the depth of your experience, and I guess not surprised. I should have known something of this magnitude in order for you to become the leader that you are.
Thank you. So that moment started to open my eyes to the work that I needed to get after, and that so I started studying. It turned out I had some gifts intellectually that I didn't know I had. And so I had to double up my junior year to take 2 years of coursework.
Make up some time.
Yeah, and so I don't say this like as like any offense to him, but I remember during that year when I was failing too, I had a guidance counselor who basically like shamed me and told me like, listen, you might want to think about vocational ed or something because I look at your academic record and I just don't know what's going to become of you. And
It's one of the
that's
greatest leading edge professors of our time.
it's so that actually motivated me. I got angry.
No, that was
And
taking a punch. That
yeah,
was taking it. That was taking a spiritual punch.
yeah. And so I just said, I'm going to get after this, man, and give it all. So I doubled up my junior year. Um, my GPA at the end of my sophomore year was something like 60 something between the 2 years because I just failed everything. And and so I think I got like, you know, mostly A's for the next 2 years. I really just worked at it. I discovered, just my father was an intellectual despite what he struggled with. So his gifts kind of arose in me in terms of my voraciousness around reading and range of intellectual interests and put that to work. I was continuing to be a very good athlete on the field. And so just became kind of more well-rounded. So um, continued on the martial arts journey since I had moved to my grandparents. I began studying with a Tang Soo Do master, another style of Korean martial art, a little bit more ancient than Taekwondo, and was just deepening there. I would go to these tournaments in Jersey City and get to fight some really scrappy guys. And I was young for my division, but I would go up against sometimes adults. And again, still loved the thrill of that, especially when I was overmatched and able to take their hits. So I'm going to come back to this hitting theme in a short while.
Mission
Um,
accepted, sir.
so so one thing that happened that I think is important to name is my mother invited me to attend a family weekend at this place in Carhunks in New York called Veritas Villa, where she was going through rehab. She was in, I believe, a 2 month program. And I went there and I got a room and there was a young black boy in the room with me who was my roommate. His name was Sean. And I got invited that night to go to a big meeting where all of the people in recovery and their family members were in the same room. And they did this technique that would be considered maybe in today's world somewhat risky. And they invited the family members if they were ready to stand up and share. And I had never done that before. And so, as you know, in the language of recovery and like Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, it's typically my name is John and I am an alcoholic or I am the child of an alcoholic. And so when it was my turn, I started thinking like, what would I say? And right when I said my name is John and I am the child of, the floodgates again. I couldn't utter a word. And so like I told like a story, bathed in tears again, and tears and water as the communicator. And something really interesting happened. A black man named Mario, just really built like um, you could tell, just like a solid guy, came up to me and he's like, "Ah, you're the one staying with my son." And I was like, "Yes, sir." And he turned out to be an exceptional martial artist. And so that night, he gave me a great gift. He came to the room where Sean and I was, and he asked us both to sit in the cross-legged position and face each other. And he said, I'm going to give you a gift, and it may take you a lifetime to realize it, but it's given in the spirit of love. And so he taught me how to breathe for the first time. I had learned to breathe naturally in martial arts and athletics in a way that worked for me, but I had never breathed in a meditative form before. And so he gave me this book, and I still have it. It's called The Finding of the Third Eye. And I had never read any real esoteric material at that point. And it was about finding this inner landscape through the lens of an image of an eye that doesn't appear on the outside but remains on the inside. And he taught me how to breathe for the first time and to close my eyes without feeling unsafe. And this might sound maybe to you or listeners or others, but he did do a gesture that was quite remarkable. And he took his thumb and he put his thumb between both of my eyes in the middle of my forehead. And I felt as if a bolt of lightning had flown through me, like my body became a capacitor. And I couldn't make meaning. And he just said, that's the gift. Find out what it means.
Unbelievable.
So I I started breathing more. I started sitting in the cross-legged position, and then the martial arts style that I was learning, we often sat seiza because we had to learn how to leap out of seiza and get into a fighting position as soon as possible. And so I started meditating. I met through a summer job I had in what was at the time a very famous New Age summer camp called New Age Health Center in Neversink, New York. And there was a man in there named Harold Weisberg who was a master, a Zen master. And I just like would watch them in there curiously. I was a dishwasher and a grounds guy because I was still in high school. And I would watch him sit for long periods and lead people on hikes and see them doing zazen in the mountaintop surrounding the health center. And I just went in one day and introduced myself and I said, would you teach me? And so he invested in teaching me um, at around, I would say that was my junior year, roughly around 16 years of age, had to sit in shikantaza, as we say in the Soto Zen tradition, which is sitting and doing nothing, becoming nobody, going nowhere, just trying to allow reality itself to become apparent. And of course, it was like hard, for me because my mind was all over. It was racing. Some of the memories that would come up early on, trauma-wise, would start to come up on the cushion, and so I spent a whole summer with Harold Weisberg, and that planted a really important seed that if we have time, I'd love to come back to. Um, and so I find
Actually,
myself
because
as
my mind is racing. Obviously, we thought about doing this a couple months ago, and the conversation we'll have now is massively different because of that. When you talked about when my mentor, who I've talked to you about, Tom Crum, is in a master in Aikido, and he first asked me like, Curt, do you ever meditate? And I replied, Sensei, I'm so busy, I don't have time to talk to myself. and so and so when you talked about the difficulty of he calls the inner dialogue your roommate, and so like my crazy roommate runs all the time, and so getting to nothingness to me is
absolutely. Oh yeah,
the most inevitable challenge of all time. And so the
absolutely.
resonance of the journeys is across different paths of warriorship.
Yeah, and
Yours is
you,
much more difficult than anything I ever experienced, but is extraordinary parallels.
And so, like these legion of angels are again, the teachers are arising. That Mario in the middle of a rehab, I turned out to, you know, that basically he said, the reason why I gave you that gift is by virtue of the love that you expressed in your testimony without saying a word. And then the Sensei Weisberg, and so these things are starting to happen that are giving me lifelines to discover truly who I am on the inside versus just learning who I am through fighting. And so my senior year, one of the things I was fascinated with as a kid was the military. My father, before he began exhibiting schizophrenic symptoms, was a U.S. Army infantry officer. And one day in his closet, I discovered all of his medals and uniforms. I used to get dressed up all the time and play war games with him. And so I I wanted to like to some degree, at one point I had, like you, wanted a naval career, maybe thought about the Naval Academy. I was obsessed with F-14 Tomcats, since I discovered the G.I. Joe
The
model of
sexiest plane
one.
of all time. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. The Sky
and
Striker.
Yeah, and then like, the GI Joe figures at the time when I was in middle school, like they actually had a model F-14. I was obsessed with this, and I'd like convince people to try to buy me all the technical manuals so I could memorize all the instrumentation if there was a technical manual. So I thought I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and so in the summer of my junior year, I was intending to apply to West Point and the U.S. Naval Academy, because I used to go to West Point every summer for their football camp under Jim Young's leadership. It was remarkable, and it kind of gave me a different kind of strength being in that environment, but also, learning a different kind of skill set in the football field. In the summer of my junior year, before I was going to transition into my exciting senior year, I got into a really bad car crash. And I hit a tree and I broke every single bone on the left side of my face. Um, and I pretty much wiped out all of my color vision in my eye and had all kinds of oculoplastic reconstruction. And I was just really saddened because they said, like, when I was talking to, I forget who I was talking to, like one of the recruiters for the Naval Academy, um, who I had told, about being an aviator, told me that, with that kind of injury, I would have to consider something different. Um, and I had thought about maybe like flying helicopters in the Army as a possible occupational pathway. And so I just kind of went into a bit of a depression, trying to find myself and what my new purpose would be now that, I think I worked myself academically back into a competitive situation. And my grandfather personally knew Senator Al D'Amato, so I knew I had a nomination, and I could go through that process or at least be competitive by virtue of that relationship, not get his support by virtue of it. Um, and so I just really didn't feel like that might be for me anymore. And so I was attending in our high school gym a college fair one day, and I saw a man in what I thought was a Navy uniform standing at one of the booths, and I went up to him and introduced myself, and he introduced a whole different pathway that up until that point I hadn't heard about, which was the U.S. Merchant Marine. And so to bring that full circle, my father failed out of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy as a moment in his life where he tried to hack it and couldn't. And there was something about my father's like being in the military and me like really wanting to honor him that I filled out an application not to the U.S. Military Academy, but the man represented. There are state level maritime schools in the country in Massachusetts, New York, and Maine, and in Texas. And so, New York Maritime Academy, which is the oldest state maritime academy, it's under the Throgs Neck Bridge in the Bronx, right across from Kings Point, who is our rival. Um, and I was like captivated by the life at sea, as a potential path for me to just like find my sea legs, pun intended. Uh, and
Absolutely.
so I applied to New York Maritime, Mass Maritime, Maine Maritime. I got into all three, and decided to go to New York because it was closer to home. And so I began a journey. The U.S. Marine Corps handles formation in the regiment, so it is a military school. It was regimented. I quickly learned that maybe, you know, the life of a military officer may not be for me. The first time a U.S. Marine got in my face and just tore me up, man. Like, so I was like, we went through this hell, like, it was like a hell 2 weeks. In a college format of like adapting to like what does it mean to march, what does it mean to stand watch, what does it mean to pick your brothers and sisters up when they fall, just like you need them to pick you up. So I started developing a different kind of leadership stride. I was an engineer. I studied marine engineering. So my academic focus was marine propulsion on merchant ships and naval ships. My roommate was a naval architect, so we kind of like geeked out a lot on content, and basically, I spent my 4 years of college every summer traveling the high seas, preparing for um, uh, taking my licensure as a Coast Guard officer in the U.S. Merchant Marine as a third assistant engineer. And, that journey alone gave me just like additional confidence and thing I can do hard things, man, and keep doing them. And my martial arts journey continued in the midst of that. I had two really good friends in upstate New York that would come to New York City on the weekends where I was working, and we would just kick each other's asses all weekend in the wrestling room. And so something happened that I'm trying to move through this timeline swiftly. Hopefully I'm doing okay because I'm going to
Brilliant.
like.
Brilliant.
So they said to me, "Hey, listen, we're gonna move to Japan next year, and we want to know if you want to come." And I was like, "Well, I'm, in college." They weren't. They had dedicated their lives to martial arts, and they had introduced me to a new system. It's called Bujinkan, Togakureru, which is a style of ninjutsu, if you will, to use that term, not to be confused with like the way ninjutsu has been popularized. But so I was learning there's this new fighting style and was just really taken by it. And so I really wanted to go and drop out, but I didn't. My grandmother played a big role in that. My father's mother, because she said, your dad was unable to finish things like the Merchant Marine Academy and these other things, and you really need to finish things. And so I stayed and I graduated. And the first thing I did was save enough money to go to Japan. And so I graduated, and shortly thereafter, my friends had already been set up there. And I quickly found myself living in a studio apartment with both of them fighting in the early Vale Tudo tournaments in Japan, where there was a constellation of fighters from different styles, Japanese, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And just like, I remember we were developing these rituals of building up our courage to go and fight in those. And and so I fought in those early on, and I took my share of losses and some wins as well. And again, back to this theme of taking the hits, I still was driven by it. There was something about the thrill of it. It wasn't even as much about victory, but being able to withstand the blow in such a way that no matter how hard you hit me, it wasn't going to put me down. That's what like drove me. And I hadn't yet still made that connection to what was lying underneath that. And so I was invited to the the sort of home base headquarters of Bujinkan is in a rural prefecture called Chiba, which is a several-hour train ride from where we were living. And I got invited to do some training there, and something angelic happened again. And that was I got thrown out of the dojo because I got asked to stand up and fight against this man from Iceland named Anthony, who had cinder blocks for arms. And at the time, I had attained some rank, and so I believe I was like maybe a Yondan, a fourth Dan black belt. And he was higher than me. He was like a Godan, or maybe more, a fifth degree black belt. Um, I went up against him, Curt, and he destroyed me almost instantaneously. And I was like, this doesn't happen to me. And so I kept getting up and going back, dispatched, getting up, dispatched, getting up and dispatched. I became so overwhelmed by anger, I lost it in front of the group and in front of what we call the Soke, the grandmaster, who's still living. And I embarrassed myself, started cursing at him and calling him names. And it was like this young child that came alive in me that had not yet been healed, that was
The,
acting out.
the next layer of that healing. Yes.
Yes. And so they told me I had to leave. I was not welcome back. And that was like my life dream. My friends were in the room. They were also really established and skilled in that system. And so the angel arose and the man who dispatched me. And as I was about to leave, he tapped me on the shoulder. And I don't know if, the synchronicity of this, because one of the things Mario said to me was, I'd like to give you a gift in the rehab center. And Anthony said the same thing. He said, you remind me an awful lot of who I was years ago. And the soke gave me a great gift. And I don't know, based upon what happened today, if he will give you the same gift, but I'm willing to ask him on your behalf. And I had no idea what he was talking about. So he went away and he pulled the soke aside because he was one of the senior students that I drew that day. Um, and he was fluent in Japanese. I was not. Spoke to the soke and said, "Come back tomorrow. I'm going to give you a note." And that was it. So I came back the next day, and the soke had written an introduction on my behalf in kanji to one of the oldest and most famous Zen temples in Japan, founded in the 12th century by Eihi Dogen, who is one of the seminal Zen masters in the Soto tradition. And so the soke had written me an introduction to the abbot of Eheji, which is this monastery carved into a mountainside with a stone Buddha on the other side. And
I'm imagining
Anthony's
you in the movie Batman, like climbing up to the edge of a mountain right now.
wasn't quite that. I took a train and then walked up a bunch of stairs, but Batman Begins, man, for sure. And so I packed my sea bag. I still had my sea bag from the Merchant Marine with like a padlock on the top, and got on a train with this thing. And Anthony said, what you're going to discover there is going to be one of the hardest things you will ever have done in your life. That's going to make Vale Tudo look like something for toddlers. And so I went there, and first thing I was captured by was the beauty of it. I had not seen nature like that before. And so there was like almost an ecological teaching right at the outset that I eventually learned as my Zen path progressed, that the aesthetic dimension is a teacher. And I had some rural experience in cool mountains when I was growing up at my grandmother's, but this was like, man, a whole nother level. So I went in, I presented the note, and I had to wait quite a while, and I finally was escorted. And then, boom, all of a sudden, I found myself adapting to a monastic tradition and routine, and I didn't speak the language. And so I learned by
You're such an
watching.
adventurer.
Yeah, like I learned by watching, and I was like, I have no idea what the soke means by this or what happened to Anthony, but I'm going to try to do it. And so all of a sudden, I found myself, nowadays Zendos have really comfortable cushions and like ways you can adapt your posture by, being as comfortable as possible, while
Not so much then.
I was like kneeling on tatami mats for periods of time with zafus that had been sat on for what appeared to be centuries, man.
Millennia.
There was no cushions. And so I was getting up super early in the morning. I was washing dishes, chopping vegetables as part of my what they call like a service part of it. Meditating 6 to 8 hours a day, attending the sort of liturgy and going out of my mind like frantic all of a sudden, like I remembered back to like the breathing and the meditation I learned in high school was much tamer and not so rigorous and vigorous. And so I packed my sea bag up one night and I put my padlock on. I said, I can't do this, man. And so I was climbing down the stairs of Aheji to get myself back to where I can take the train. And I just like felt this gentle force, like kind of revealed to me that you must turn around. And so I did, and I kept enduring, and it got more painful and more painful and more painful. And then the Dalai Lama uses a term in one of his books that I don't like in myself to this per se, but the analogy might work to illustrate an experience I had, which was one particular day. I stayed at Eheji for 6 months. One particular day along that journey, um, I was sitting shikantaza, and um, when you have 6 hours of that a day, and then during periods of sesshin, 10 hours a day, you sometimes learn how to tune out, to numb. But that particular day was not in store for
No
me that
luck.
day. And so I I was sitting there in shikantaza, and this is the terminology the Dalai Lama names, and he says it's as if a flash of lightning emerges in the dark of night. And something happened where, for a brief moment, the way I've described this, that I've found subsequent meaning in studying like koans and other sort of Zen stories, was there was a dissolution of a boundary between my subjective self and the objective, what I perceived as an objective other world. And so there was this momentary collapse of subject and object, such that I saw a different and felt deeply a different sense of reality. And it was didn't last quite long. And that gave me like this fuel to go even deeper in my practice, man. And so I shared my experience in, there's a form of combat in Zen called Dakusan, where you go and you bow and you sit in front of the master, and he or she may say something, and you have an opportunity to say something in return, or you may just start talking, and frequently, the bell rings faster than you can complete the words and you're out. And I sort of shared this experience. And in the language of Zen, it was a glimpse of what we learn in that tradition as Kensho. And I've spent my lifetime trying to both recover that, so it was more prevalent, and at the same time recognize that it's not necessary. Um,
I mean, John, I have like chills because you could have no way of knowing that the thing that's coming up for me that was going to share is like my mentor and I were talking yesterday, talking about the Kensho warrior, and we've been working on, for me, as you know, from my background in the SEALs, like my whole life has been the unstoppable force, right? And so um, I'm in a progression now. The 50 comes next week, and so it feels very interesting. Like, what is next? What is the next portal? And so the term we've come up with is the Kensho warrior. Like, what is the enlightened warrior that's beyond next? And so I'll read you one of the shares he just earlier this week had sent to me, because I had sent him some the child reaching in the darkness for a thing they don't understand. And he'd come back and said, "Hey, I love reading your brilliant thoughts. Where I appeared different in my own understanding, which is super light for, I have a 180-degree perspective." But he said, the Kensho warrior represents the quality of water. When quiet, it reflects the whole universe back onto itself, no teaching necessary. When it flows, it is unstoppable through its exquisite blending nature, no friction or conflict necessary. Kensho warrior fits appropriately in any environment, not because it is immovable, but because there is no place that one can find to push back or strike without getting wet, soaked with the new learning. In every case, a blending, no teacher teaching, to your point. The blending, the flow, the infinite potential is always there. The Kensho warrior is not immovable, and it's not an object. It is a quality of being that accepts all and appropriately moves through and around all, melting away resistance as simply a matter of course over time with infinite acceptance and, yes, love. And so, like, when you said, your quest to Kensho, like, unbelievable.
no coincidence. Thank you for sharing that. When I left Eheji, I left my anger behind.
And was it
And
from
so
that moment that you had the awareness, or was it throughout that you just knew you were leaving that behind as you left
I, I didn't
that place?
realize it until after, but um,
Hey, it feels a little lighter.
no, like yeah, it not only lighter, but
So it was
like
a gift from from the defeat when you lost your temper. Like they literally gave you that gift. They knew exactly the
exactly
gift you were going to get. Yeah.
that's the gift Anthony was referring to. which is like you've got to get a hold of that which is giving rise to that anger. The reason why you like taking the hits and enjoy that is not normal, right? There's something behind that. And what I learned at Aheji was all of that anger that had grown roots, that had hardened into its own character and inhabited all of like my body, was truly like the driver of the chariot, so to speak. And I was able to, through that, the gift of that time of 6 months, to truly lose it. It's a miracle. I did nothing other than sit shikantaza for 6 months and participate in the life of that monastic community, with no direct therapy, no, there were what are called, teishos, or talks that, a senior teacher or the abbot would give. That's where you get a little bit of, and fortunately, there was a student who could translate for me. Later on what the fruits of that was. And so like some of these shows had really amazing nuggets for my reflection, and I haven't been angry since. And
I've
so,
never experienced that from you.
and
In
I,
fact, that's why your story is so jarring, because I would have never, like as a kinesthetic, I never felt any of that capacity. So I guess completely aligns. And I love your
so,
language of. I mean, this is the fascinating thing. The from human doer to human being, right? Like from your awareness, you're like, I did nothing, but from someone listening to this as myself, like you literally followed every possible path that you possibly could, right? Never said no. I mean, to get kicked out of a dojo, I can imagine like the shame,
yeah,
because you're quote a master there, and then to get kicked out and then and then say, hey, by the way, go to this club in 3D senses. It's unbelievable, and you're like, okay. In the midst of all of this pain, and angst, I'm going to now follow the path of the people that just rejected me. I mean, how unbelievably superhuman that is. I mean, another conversation that's also alive. So in Sensei's book, Magic of Conflict, and you talk about, he's a master of Aikido, so it's fascinating that we're all sharing this. But he was talking about Buckminster Fuller, and to me, the thing I want to highlight here, because it is often, my friend Jordan Hall talks about infinitesimal courage, right? Heroic courage is often easier than infinitesimal courage, because heroic courage either run into a hail of gunfire or abandon your friends, right? It's often easier than infinitesimal, which is maybe this doesn't matter that much. And then to me, Bucky Fuller, who worked with Sensei a lot, talked about, I'll read this part from the page where he said, they were working on building this geodesic dome at Windstar, which was Sensei and John Denver, and that was like their organization when they were trying to drive the future, right? And so our tendency is to disregard evidence that continuing the project no longer meets our purpose. We find it difficult to radically change our original intentions, even though out of integrity we must do so. This became clear when I appeared at my office at Windstar at 7 a.m. the next morning, ready to check in on all the logistics of the project, and Buckminster Fuller, was there and had declared immediately, I have discovered it was inappropriate to go ahead with the structure at this time. I was not thinking clearly last night and have recognized my errors in calculation. And on his desk, he found a letter in Bucky's handwriting entitled Errors. So like no hiding, like errors in large capitals. And then the note said, when you have made an error, the first thing to do is to say so quickly and stop the derivative action. Stop. And so I love, it takes the real courage to discover our own errors and do something about them without procrastinating or fearing the judgment of others. And to me, that's the courage that you demonstrated so many times of, okay, this didn't work. I'm going to literally go straight back at the people that rejected me and accept humbly their advice
yes,
on where to go next. To me, so many teachings in your sharing of your story of how you just followed the path that would appear impossible and completely irrational, yet you literally followed it courageously without doubt.
after that experience, I went back into the Merchant Marine, and I got a job. I
I can
got,
only imagine that was a
yeah,
bit of a transition.
yeah. I went back, because I wanted to fulfill, like I wanted to sail, I got this license. And so
And was
I
that to finish what you began, right?
well, I had graduated. I had taken and passed my test to be a third assistant engineer in the Coast Guard, to be an officer on a boat. But I had temporary pause going out to sea because of the Japan experience. And I didn't know that I would come back, but I knew that's what my purpose was. Sort of my compass was pointing me back, not to stay. My friends stayed, and both became just incredible humans. One married into a Japanese family, and that has like a chain of restaurants around Tokyo, and so he helps the family manage that. And then Chris was his name, which was like truly the best among us. He um, ended up becoming a Pan American champion in jiu-jitsu. So he left Bujinkan and studied with one of the best, I think, Brazilian fighters ever. His name was Rickson Gracie. He could literally contort his body. You just couldn't grab him. You couldn't hold him. So he studied with Rickson, and Rickson's brother his name was Henzo. And Chris became a kind of a renowned teacher in those circles. And he himself married into an ancient judoka family in Japan. And so he married his wife, who was a judoka, and they moved to Hawaii and started a dojo together, which to my understanding, is still thriving. And so, but I came back, and I put my name on the union board, so to speak, looking for a ride. And I got called by a company out of the Midwest, and they were contracted by at the time, Kofi Annan's Food for Oil program. And basically, they converted oil tankers to grain tankers, and would take grain, ship it from Portland, Oregon to Karachi, Pakistan. And basically, we would unload the tankers filled with grain on the ship, and then of course the company would get like these different kind of vouchers. There were both like financial incentives, energy incentives. So I started sailing that route. Um, Got to see it like a different part of the world. We would refuel in Singapore, but Karachi was like the Wild West when I got there. It was like people walking around casually with shotguns and AK-47s, you know. I got a tour of Karachi in this small taxi with a guy who thought like the best gift he could provide me was like play a Tupac Shakur rap tape. So we jammed out the
So you
Tupac
felt at
driving around,
home.
driving around Karachi. So it was just really remarkable formation, sailing in that regard. And um, I had an epiphany one night at sea. I stood the 4 to 8 watch twice a day and worked in between, and then slept.
4 a.m.
And
to 8 a.m.
yeah, and then
Yep.
4 p.m. to 8 p.m. And
Okay,
what
two
you,
cycles. Yep.
yep, 2 cycles every day, and then an in between cycle where you're expected to work and do like preventive maintenance in the engine room, etc. And I remember one of the requirements, if you're the officer of the watch for 4 to 8, um, you know, you had to relieve uh, some of your fellow officers so they could eat. So I remember this one particular time I relieved a guy, and right after that, I just went on deck, and it was like a remarkable starry night, sort in the middle of the Pacific. And no, not the Pacific at that point. We were um, sort of there's a port in Pakistan, uh, in Karachi, called the port of Mohammed bin Qasim. And so we were kind of like in those waters, like heading back out. And the stars were just like ridiculous. And I had this like sense of like vocation, the question of vocation. Do you want to make your identity this kind of life? Because you are suited for adventure, and you work literally 6 months a year, and what you do at the other six, you can figure out. And so I had this calling emerge, which I think is probably important for the second portion of our call. Was I My grandparents were teachers, right? And I remember growing up really appreciating that, how they embodied that craft. Summers off, I thought it was cool, so my grandfather could give me lots of attention. and take me to football camps at West Point, and then their life during the year just seemed really exciting. And although I identified engineering as like what I thought, I started at that moment to start thinking about becoming a high school teacher. And so I thought, you know what I could do? I could put together like the secret life of Walter Mitty, right? And basically be teacher by year and merchant officer during the summers, right? It would be an ideal way to make an actual like good living by supplementing my teacher salary with like merchant wages. And so basically teach all year, get on a boat, right? And bring those stories back to the classroom. And so that's like, I don't know if now is like, I mean, there's so much to say, like from then until I'll be 53. So I began my journey not long thereafter, going back to school and getting my credentials as an educator. And so then the fun really starts to take off.
Well, John, I think as we transition to the next part, I'd say for anybody that's stuck, for anybody that feels any level of the impossibility that you felt when you were alone as a freshman, or when you were getting beat up as an 8-year-old, or you were getting kicked out of a dojo after losing your temper in a fight. If you had a word or a perspective, what would you share with them at that moment? You're not met through our dear friend Jamie Wheel, and I'll see if I can pull up the amazing quote that he gave me from Terence McKenna. This is what comes to mind for me as a reflection of your story. I love that quote of nature loves courage. You make the commitment, and nature will respond to that commitment by removing impossible obstacles. Dream the impossible dream, and the world will not grind you under, it will lift you up. This is the trick. This is what all the teachers and philosophers who really counted, who really touched the alchemical gold, this is what they understood. This is the shamanic dance in the waterfall. This is how magic is done, by hurling yourself into the abyss and discovering it's a featherbed. I remember when Jamie shared that with me. That's how every one of those portals has felt to me. And to me, as you shared that story, that's exactly what came up for me. Each time you went through the portal, suffering to me is the moment you have a choice to go through and choose not. And so now you end up stuck in a cycle. And so to me, pain is what you go through when you're transcending through. And then the other side, it's always, why did I wait so long? And the suffering is when I get stuck in that. But I would just love we have unbelievable embodied reflections that you just shared with us, but anything that you would share with us is,
Yeah, I think what's arising for me is that love wins above all. And it was through that, I mean, love emerged in likely and unlikely sources, in the form of people, in the form of pets, in the form of nature, in the forms of gifts. And despite, you know, the terrain of pain that was seemingly present in all directions continuously, love has this capability of penetrating anything.
no, I mean, I felt it the moment you shared your grandmother taking the call and instantly driving
Yes.
down,
Yeah.
or
And
from the gentleman that touched you in the rehab facility, or the love that one of that senior student shared when he said, "Oh, you just lost it, but I love you enough to not just kick you out of the door." Right? I mean, so unbelievable. I mean, love
love
wins.
wins.
That's my quote for the year. Oh, thank you, sir. I mean, thank you for the unbelievable share. And then if ever there's an inspirational story, that was like 17 of them. I mean, unbelievable. And I'm sure that you gave us the highlight reel of a few of them. And so you're starting to transition. I thought that, now that is who you've become, right? You are those teachers and philosophers who really counted, who touched the alchemical gold. This is what you understand. And so teach us where you're going next as you've gone into this phase of your life.
Went back to school and knew I didn't want to, I wanted to teach with kids who were like me growing up. And so I found myself, I was invited to go to San Antonio for a while in the midst of a merchant experience. I had a good friend of mine who lived there who was also a merchant officer. He's a captain, actually. And He invited me to come to San Antonio to spend time, and I really liked it there, and ended up staying and made a home there, and went back to school to be a teacher. Found my first job and immediately just like fell in love. I I for the first time really started to locate this sense of like what purpose means, and because like working with young, I worked mostly with young people from the west side of San Antonio, which is a historically turbulent, traumatized community, and it shows up in schools. And so I just threw myself into the fire of trying to, put my hands into their human development and shape them in ways that I had learned along the way. And so I I taught literature because that was the area where I just like, it's like the one thing I could teach and really enjoy teaching, despite having like an engineering background. So when I went back to school, I got a dual degree in literature and education, so I could get the
As you do.
certification. you know, and started working with that mostly Latino students and understanding their worldviews and their realities. I became a football coach. So it was a way to bring that legacy. And so I was a coach, and that gives you like immediate street cred, when people know you do that. So I had like a gaggle of boys that, would just surround me to be like, hey, and so it was a wonderful, my first job in education was so formative for me. It brought me alive. I taught 6 classes a day, 30 kids in each class. So 3 times 6, do the math. That's a lot of human beings to put your hands on. And it was truly to this day the best job I've ever had in my life. Um, but alas, what you start noticing is the way in which the system gets in the way of human development. And so I was kind of being promoted, en route to becoming a principal. And I just thought, like, there was a book I read at the time that was formative. It was called I Chose to Stay. And it was about a principal who could have been anything in education. He could have been a superintendent, could have been a secretary of ed, who knows? But he decided to stay in a particular neighborhood for a long period of time and truly make a difference. I didn't feel that that was my calling. I felt like the system level was my dance floor needed to be a bit bigger, so to speak. So I was like, I need to become the superintendent of this district. That's really where I can move the needle. And so, but I couldn't become a superintendent without going back to school. And so in order to do that, you got to get a doctorate in Texas. And so I was like, okay, like where can I go to school and get my doctorate and go back to school again and learn, and then, have a triumphal arrival again as maybe the leader of this place. And so I looked at a few places, tried to be, smart about picking programs that were highly ranked. And so it turned, the one that was closest, that was really highly ranked, was what's called the Public School Executive Leadership Program at the University of Texas at Austin. And so I started there on that track with a cohort of people in preparation to become a school superintendent. And just exciting to be back in a learning environment. Again, my intellectual curiosity started to come to life in later high school, but in college. I remember I used to hate like being stuck on base, so to speak, on the weekends. But when I could get off base on the weekends, I was reading Joseph Campbell's biography called A Fire in the Mind while I was at the academy. And I would sneak out and take the number 6 bus, get on the train, and go to the museums that Joseph Campbell wrote about, like the Museum of Natural History, and just like falling in love with mythology. And so in my master's program, I was tumbling even deeper and studying not just literature, but theology and philosophy. And so I was really coming alive. And so uh, I discovered the University of Texas at Austin's library. And oh man, it's the closest thing to Hogwarts at the time that you could, so I pushed my cart firmly through the 9 3/4 pathway and just started to become like an intellectual, like compulsive about that kind of learning. And so I met this guy again. The people come, man. His name was Curtis. And he's like, you're not like the usual guy that normally, he was in a different program. So he's like, you're not the usual kind of superintendent candidate. And so he's like, he's like, I really appreciate having you in class and hearing your ideas. He's like, have you thought about like the academic path or academic career of the professor? And I was like, I haven't thought of that. I've been thinking I want to go back to this district and run it. And he's like, well, I want to introduce you to the head of that program, and, just have a conversation. That way you at least know that within the College of Education, there's this other more intellectually focused PhD program. The other one was like an EDD, more kind of practical doctorate degree that you didn't have to dissertate on. But this was like the mecca of like educational ideas. And so I met this guy. He's famous in school leadership circles, the master of the politics of education named Jay Scribner. And just after the first meeting, I knew I was doomed to. No, I was not going back to be the superintendent, Curt.
You're another new dojo. Yep.
Exactly. So I was like, wow. And so like I applied. The name of the program was like, it was a PhD in educational leadership with a focus on education strategy, policy, and planning, right? Which allowed you to boundary span like the intellectual realm, but then start asking big questions around how do systems and policies need to change to make education better, right? So my degree was amazing because I did half of my coursework in the College of Ed and then most of the rest of it at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And so I didn't know who LBJ was at the time. And then I discovered the LBJ library right next door. And man, talk about like a policy tsunami. When I saw all the many things he passed immediately, almost immediately after he was sworn in, after President Kennedy was assassinated, I just had never encountered that kind of remarkable, diffusion of what I call pro-human policy, you know. And so I was just coming alive, and then I just started to feel like, you know, my compass shifted a bit. I was like, I just want to like spend my life like reading, studying, and teaching. Kind of like a high school teacher, right? But different, right? And so
Just like
I
in life as a merchant marine, exactly the same.
exactly right. Maybe I could sail, no, too. I could take summers off too. But so I got on the academic track, and decided that I had some intellectual curiosity that I could make a life out of research, teaching, and service, which are kind of like the three pillars of higher ed. So my first job as an academic was at Hofstra University in Long Island, where I taught like aspiring principals. I was then recruited to go to a medical school, actually. The University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston Medical School has a kind of an interdisciplinary institute there. It was called the Children's Learning Institute. And what they did is they looked at ways that you could start to think about the needs of children developmentally from a broad array of lanes. And so even though I was not medically trained, I was recruited to become like a leader in that institute and sort of really like took off. I started learning about neuroscience. I started learning about psychology, about pediatrics and medicine, and thinking about like ecological approaches to understanding sort of like Yuri Bronfenbrenner, a famous psychologist from Cornell, created this model of like these nested systems that impede or provide pathways for our development. So really came alive in that environment. Left there for the University of Chicago, and so along the way I tenured. And so, that was like a pretty significant milestone you alluded to in your introduction,
One of
because
many.
yeah, it can become either a great gift or means to enhance your service, or it can become a safe zone to like coast, right? And I saw way too many people coasting on that journey. I certainly didn't. After I got tenure, I was trying to be as productive as possible. Tenure actually does provide, like the purpose of tenure, right, is so you can speak the truth without fear of repercussion. And we know that is becoming murky these days, murkier and murkier as that to the degree to which one can actually speak the truth. But um, so I saw it as a protective gift foundation to accelerate my impact. So at the University of Chicago, I became a CEO of a very cool ed tech company called U Chicago Impact. I'd never been a CEO before, but I was like professor CEO model, and so I was like had to learn how to
I
like
don't think they have that model, John. I think that's a new one.
but I did it, it was like incredible. And so I was having lunches with trustees at the University of Chicago, which is like just this incredible place, like what I call like the Valley of Gargoyles, because most people don't know, like early on, the former president of Harvard got recruited to be the president of the University of Chicago and said, we have to create an institution that is not only better, but looks like aesthetically different. So he traveled to Oxford and loved that sort of gothic look. And so now if you go to the University of Chicago, it's like gargoyles everywhere. And so I was like in the land of gargoyles, hanging out with trustees, and they were writing me checks to basically, get this company like off the ground. And so our job was to go and challenge school districts by saying, we're really interested in helping you solve the most important problems of practice that you have. And what we'd like to do is, so one of the things the company did was took all this tech that professors developed at the University of Chicago through like big grants, like NIH grants, and then like kind of like somewhat like leverage them into the market, monetize them, and sell them to schools to help them get better. And so part of it was this, like me learning how to be a salesperson, which was scary. It was scarier than getting on the mat, man. Like having a cold call with somebody, like initially was like, oh my God. And so started learning all these new things and failing early on often, but having a really strong board. I never managed a board before, a trustees that were there to push me and guide me, and they mostly did that balance really well. The president of the University of Chicago, who's like won like the Fielding Medal in mathematics, Bob Zimmer, was on my board, and I remember like these
Of course he
lessons.
was.
Yeah, he was like, listen, you cannot talk about strategy or give me any strategy documents to read that are longer than a page, half a page preferred. And so I would be like pushed to like really synthesize and condense ideas, or else you could just see him grimace. And he was ready to like throw that Fielding medal at me like a shuriken. So kind of like got to travel around the country, participate in the intellectual life of the University of Chicago. It was a remarkable time. And then the call to leadership happened.
President, professor, CEO is not yet the call to leadership. So let's
It
please
was,
define the next call to leadership.
yeah, it was a remarkable. And then I was at the Omega Institute, if you know it, in Rhinebeck, New York, which is like this old school holistic center, as in Alpha and Omega.
Mm-hmm.
It was named after a Jesuit theologian, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who talked about the ultimate evolution point of a human is what he called the Omega point, which is where there are no differences, right? So I was at the Omega Institute doing a summer like retreat, and I got a ping on LinkedIn from a headhunter, and they said your name has come up as a potential candidate for a leadership role in higher education in Dallas, Texas. And there's a University of North Texas, that has been established, like a 50,000 strong university, and they wanted to be more service oriented to a part of Dallas that had been historically underrepresented for the whole, like as long as Dallas has been around. And so they wanted to build a new campus called the University of North Texas at Dallas, and launched that. And they wanted to hire the right kind of people to serve as, quote, the startup deans of those programs. And so the advertisement was a dean of a college of education that needed to be, it had already had some liftoff, but really needed to be truly started up well and properly. And so I was like, wow, that kind of replicates my academic background and interests, my startup experience, kind of taking on this company at the University of Chicago. And so I maybe could be very competitive for this as the dean. And so ended up winning the role and traveled to Dallas. And you talk about like entering a system that's largely impenetrable and averse to creativity and change in many ways. So what was interesting is at the time they had a renegade university president that they purposefully hired because he was different. He's still around. He's not the president anymore. I'll call him out. His name is Bob Mong. Bob Mong was a star quarterback, college quarterback, decided he wanted to be a reporter, worked his way into the newsroom in Dallas and became the editor in chief of the Dallas Morning News. Story career. The chancellor of the University of North Texas System said, I need you to run this university. We need a Renaissance man to go into this community and make this happen. So Bob was on the search committee. The dean of the law school, who was a famous federal judge, Royal Ferguson, was in the mix. And there was an innovative provost who would be my boss, who's now in Chicago. And they painted this vision of like, we're going to actually try to do something uniquely innovative and creative at this university. And we want you to be the dean to lead that. And so, to sweeten it, I was still like thinking about a few other things, maybe staying. Um, and the mayor at the time, Mike Rawlings of Dallas, like one of the sort of really prominent people in the community, said, "Can you please call this guy and try to convince him to come to Dallas?" And so when I got the call from the mayor, I knew like I was going to have to get the moving company.
New dojo.
I was like, there's stuff happening if the mayor's involved and the philanthropic community, and we're gonna park like a carrier, an oasis of like higher education in one of the most distressed communities in Dallas. Like I am in, man. I'm ready to take those hits. And so I got there and I spent 4 years in that role, and there was a lot of success. We did a lot of great things, but there was also what I realized is I had a conversation, and I won't call this person out, but the provosts changed hands. And the first provost that hired me, our relationship was anchored in a support for risk and innovation. Another provost came in, and the background of that provost was much more traditional in academia. Like, let's make sure we're constantly compliant in all the standards and everything. And I was just, that wasn't my style. And so it was clear the gifts that I had would not thrive under that leadership style. And I remember there was a comment that was made where she said, "Dr. Gasko, I appreciate all you're trying to do, but what I need to effectively do here is clip your wings." And
Easy
and
day. You
I
can have my wings.
I was,
Namaste.
I was like, this absolutely not. So the president at the time, who always supported me and was just really terrific about supporting me throughout. But, he was trying to build a university, and this provost had gifts that the university needed about building the academic programs. And so I was prepared to step down, and, he like immediately hired me on as his special advisor and gave me some special projects. And I quickly learned, like studying how to get bonds passed to build new academic facilities is just not my wheelhouse. And so I but I had tenure, right? So I could have stepped down from my dean role and just retreated. That's like language, you retreat back to your faculty line, and I could just taught. And so it just didn't, sit right, man. And so I met this trailblazer in education, who was leading one of Texas's largest public charter school systems called Uplift Education, where I've been since then for the past 7 years. And she and the board gave me the opportunity of a lifetime, right? Which was,
Amongst the many lifetimes you've lived, but
yeah,
yes.
maybe, but to leverage all that I had learned on my education journey in high schools, at the university level, and start to crack a black box that schools have heretofore, and in many cases still are behind on. And that is this tsunami that has landed and is everywhere prevalent, and particularly in public schools, which is the mental health challenges and struggles of young people that have been undiagnosed, not assessed, and are showing up in classrooms everywhere. And teachers and leaders and parents have become so frustrated in not knowing what to do. I wanted to imagine a completely different model of schooling where the functions that were heretofore on the back burner, like medicine, health care, mental health care, physical education, social and emotional competency, like student character building and discipline. I wanted to leverage all those into what I call a well-being model, um, which I derived the model from an Aristotelian model of eudaimonia, which is like a comprehensive way to think about well-being for adults and children. So my model was not just grounded in, like, we call our students at Uplift, all 24,000 of them, like scholars. But I knew, like, adult culture is scholar culture, right? Human resource systems have been woeful in supporting the well-being of teachers and leaders in education. We provide them with benefits and say, Curt, if something's wrong, take your health care card that you're paying gazillions of dollars to maintain the premium period, and just like go see your doctor and figure it out, man. There's not much we can do, but kind of reimagining what adult support looks like in the education system, in addition to student support. And so we've, for the past, and I got hired in like a liminal moment, November 2019. I first met you in February of 2020, at 1440, right? At the launch of this Flow Genome project, like flow performance coaching program, right? And so I found myself there, uh, didn't realize I was literally going to get the last flight out of San Francisco before everything shut down because of COVID. Uh, didn't realize, I had met my, like, what my the best teacher I've ever had in the history of my life there, who's now my wife, whom there. And so it was like so
Huge
much,
fan.
so so much. Yeah, so Camila, if you're listening, we love you. And so I had to be the chief well-being officer, and nobody was in school. And so early on had to, like, think about design and how to bring about, like, fortunately we learned how to use Zoom in creative ways. And so I was like learning, really, like, building a plane, in the midst of this like really difficult pandemic period, and learned a ton. And so we've come a long way, on this journey. And so, what we're trying to do to make the impossible inevitable is to truly transform the paradigm of of the fundamentals of what education is about, because they have become captured in instrumental, sort of, trapped in political debate, caught up in policy discourses, where we've reified what it means to be a human being by virtue of whether you can attain an actual low bar score on a standardized instrument, a blunt indicator, that tells us you can pass go and move on. You've done your work. Where, what brought me to life intellectually was just harder and harder to think about in these systems. And so, one of the beautiful things about Uplift Education is it is the only international baccalaureate program for all in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And so if you know anything about IB, it is a model that was designed to support the education of UN diplomats. and foreign service workers, a model of schooling that we could establish throughout the world where kids could get a really rigorous intellectual experience combined with other aspects of their journey from service, creativity, filmmaking, you name it. They also had this interesting thread of learning, which is emotion as a way of knowing. And I thought, wow, if ever there was a lane to swim in, to bring a well-being model to life, the IB model sort of helps us to be more creative and innovative. But still, at the end of the day, all public schools in Texas are held to the same standard, regardless of model, right? Regardless of what you're trying to reinforce. And that is, at the end of the day, we are going to put a sticker or a report card grade on your school, A through F. And that score is derived based upon important things, right? Literacy, numeracy, college or career readiness, military readiness, but still is, you know, that system is designed to drive a particular pedagogy and way of attaining results that are limiting. And so I feel I'm trying to birth the impossible in the midst of that so that maybe the poly crisis within which we're firmly enmeshed can speak loudly enough to tell us that if we don't start, number one, helping young people develop their inner powers of things like self-awareness, self-regulation, durability in the midst of challenge, how to collaborate with people, like all things we don't test at all in our education systems, right? Some people dabble in it. We're trying to go into the deep end of the pool and all pretend we're Aquaman, like trying to bring this vision to life, and but
Let's
it's
go.
hard. It's hard because like the system challenges and some of the partisan politics around what children need. With AI, we're all woefully behind, even though like teachers are not ignorant, right? AI Claude is like the name of every single student in all of our high schools because Claude's like turning in the work for them. They'll put their name on the top, right? But truly, the author of most artifacts that are going in is like Chat GPT, Claude, Chat on, whatever it is, man, Colossus, Grok. And so, but what we're not doing is we've created ways to use this as a really powerful tool to reduce like cognitive load, for example, which is a challenge too, because like the magnitude of the challenges we're facing requires that we not turn over our agency.
Stronger
And
cognitive load. Yep.
exactly, so I'm trying to think about now, how to leverage these technologies to not only help young people leverage up, level up on and heal up on their well-being and sort of what their human development in that lane, but like how to become leaders in utilizing this technology for the good, and learning early on. It's not about using these tools for extraction or to simply be more competitive or to reinforce the same things that have created these big problems in the first place. And of course, that we're working on that now. But if ever there was a time, to be for me to be alive, it's now. You
Today's the
know,
day.
yeah. If ever there was a time, right, to truly put our hands on the hilt of Excalibur and draw that sword and wield it in the midst of all this, all that's alive and around, and including complexity, uncertainty. It's like, so I feel like, I'm where I need to be. The things I've learned along the way, like giving back to young people in terms of their mental health journeys, represents a gift that I was given, in helping kids who have been beaten down in their communities, in their neighborhoods, sometimes in their classrooms, get access to a restorative vision that is the complete opposite, so that they can, you know, get this precious gift called a secure attachment with at least one adult. who communicates love and care to them that they're not finding anywhere else. Like if I can contribute to the formation and cultivation of those kinds of adults, like those are like the knights of the round table in this era, man. And
So
so,
John, so John, like one, we're in. How do we help? And so I think you laid out a couple of things that are fascinating. The greatest challenge I see in the world is people say, "I'd like to do something. We know there's a problem, but it's too big. I don't know what to do, so I do nothing." So this is the fun part. How do we help to support you in that quest? One I heard is find one child and help to give them a secure attachment, right? A condition of where they feel loved. But like, I would love if there's a handful of others, or tell us how to support you in this quest. Like, grabbing
yeah.
Excalibur sounds that sounds like the thing to do. It
Well,
always is the thing to do.
one is, I've tried to be creative. What I learned from, our time together in sort of the Flow Genome Project, was, like some of the terminology you and Jamie introduced us to around like, you know, what are the conditions needed to get into flow? What are the conditions needed so that you can learn to steer properly? And even when you're over your skis, like kind of find a way to steer back and find balance. And so I brought that kind of thinking to how to think about leveraging adults, right, to get stronger, more durable, more emotionally resilient. And so I've been running these, what I call them well-being cohorts, which is every month bringing together by application people who want to go on a journey, a hard journey, right? They want to commit to their sacred calling to be teachers or leaders, or in some cases like cafeteria workers, because we train everybody who wants to join. And but they're so close to burnout that they just don't know quite what to do. So we've tried to create this pathway. And it's been the most successful program that we run. So we put them in cohorts. We don't call them boat teams, but smaller teams that are working on challenges together. Sometimes that challenges. Every month we introduce them to like what we call an encounter, and we just give them an address, and we don't even tell them what they're going to do. It's just be there on time, and they'll go and they get there, and all of a sudden, what they see is like a chef and a huge like kitchen, and they have to learn how to make gourmet meals together from scratch, right? Like if you think about like what's needed to be able to shift into that lane, then the next month we'll take them to do something that most of them have never done in their lifetime, which is like bouldering, and they've got these indoor climbing gyms, right? And we start to introduce them to modalities of bringing the body online. Like the body of the teacher has been lost to stress, to really deleterious, hormones. If you look in the classrooms of teachers, a universal symbol of their struggles physiologically is what I call in Texas the big gulp, right? And so you can go to
Yeah.
Whataburger. You don't just get a small like I did at Burger King back in the day, man. You get the big gulp, man, because the big gulp serves an important purpose. It kind of gives you that Coca-Cola at that almost a 2 liter level, gives you like a jolt, man, that of course you crash from, and so we're trying to help them reimagine what does it mean to nourish themselves? What does it mean to move the body? And so we do all these challenges. And then the capstone at the end of the year is driven by, our trip to the canyons, which is we drop them into foreign territory and invite them to figure it out, man. And so we teach them how to put up a tent, how to camp on the ground. 90% of the people that I've taken on this journey have never slept on the ground before. And so we take them to really fabulous places. My Zen journey shows up here because the journey of aesthetic beauty, whether it's a rock garden, whether it's like the way that flowers are curated in the dojo or in the temple, that, you know, um, there's an early childhood framework um, that talks about the environment, like as a third teacher, right? So we want to bring them. So basically, I've taken people to Sedona now, Big Sur, the Redwoods, in
All the
Mendes,
places of awe, all
Mendes,
the big
yeah,
ones.
all
You
of
got to
them,
get up
and
Yosemite.
and
Yosemite.
And when you see a teacher climb a rock, which they've never done in their life, in like an acupuncture point on the earth called like Shasta or in Sedona, right? And they climb that thing, and for the first time, they breathe in that panoramic vision and the same language that shows up in me, which is this torrent of tears, happens, then they realize I can do this, man. And so, to your point of helping, I'm trying to figure out ways to like bring in partnership and leaders who can help us continue to think creatively about what are the kinds of small micro experiences. That's like a kind of an extreme cohort year-long model. Like what are the adaptive learning experiences that I don't yet know how to do that I can introduce adults and kids to help them start to develop these new superpowers that they're all going to need.
Amen. Oh, it's amazing. I mean, John, the arc, the story, the quest you're on is the quest for all of us. So it is amazing. Everybody knows it's hard for me to be speechless, but like the only answer is yes.
Goal,
So
un
exciting.
goal. Yeah, amazing.
What an incredible journey for anyone that's as inspired as I am by your quest. How did they reach out to you? How do they contact you? How do they find you? And how do they lock arms in the surf zone with you and start to help?
Yeah, well, of course, with the tools that we have make that kind of contact easy. I'm John Gasko on LinkedIn. You'll see me, and Uplift Education. I also do work for a global project called the Wellbeing Project, which is about helping change makers around the world who are struggling to continue to do frontline work in really important fields, stay the course in that work. So that's just a whole nother way in which I've been able to like leverage, my gifts and talents in ways that might be useful to. So the Wellbeing Project works with, I was founded by someone who was an Ashoka Fellow who himself burnt out and went on a 7-year journey of like revitalization and has created this organization, the Wellbeing Project, to really go into communities in all parts of the world where people are, for example, I met a guy trying to figure out how to create climate resilient coral that has been destroyed in hurricanes in the Bahamas. But this is the kind of people that are in the world that
Awesome.
are making life possible, but yet they're floundering. And so how do we create, like, remember Jamie talked about that triangle of like catharsis, ecstasis, and communitas?
Communitas.
Like
Yes.
that's essentially what the Wellbeing Project does, is it helps you find ways in which to heal, find catharsis, ways in which to activate joy, ecstasy, and then do that in a container of like community so you can find your purpose again and stay the course. So some, you could find me in that work. And so, I'm truly humbled and grateful. I listened to many of the podcasts that you've done going into this one to just try to, you know, hopefully represent, because the quality of individuals, I have to say, was like quite intimidating. So, I really appreciate the opportunity. One, to be invited by you, Curt, whom I deeply respect and admire, and then thinking about the kinds of individuals that you're talking to in the world. I really do find myself in a disposition of humility and gratitude for just being able to share my story with you.
It's my fortune to know you, sir. So I asked a question earlier that was how do you help people to continue in crisis, which is really kind of the first one. I think the one that's the most challenging and that you're a master of is how do you follow that tug? How do you follow that calling through all those transitions? Like in this one, like, when you have no path and it's never been done before, what's your protocols for following next when next is not yet unknown?
Exactly. Yeah. And for me, shikantaza, it's in the silence where the path becomes clear, man, for me.
That works for you. I gotta get to work for me. That's amazing. Well, thank you,
Okay.
sir. It's been an incredible honor and privilege. Like
Thanks,
the
Kurt.
work, the miracles you bring to the world, the impact you have on everyone. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
all you do.
Thank you, Kurt.